There was always a friendly rivalry between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, two bands that defined the sound, the style, and the spirit of the 1960s. But beneath the smiles and compliments, there were moments of tension, and even quiet judgment. While the world saw them as equals, the musicians themselves were always listening, sometimes admiring, sometimes criticizing. And for Mick Jagger, one Beatles song in particular crossed the line from clever to just plain silly. That song was Maxwell's Silver Hammer. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were no longer the four mop-topped boys who sang about holding hands. They were experimenting, breaking apart, and trying to find meaning in the chaos of fame. In the middle of that transformation came Abbey Road, an album celebrated as one of the greatest ever made, but buried among masterpieces like Come Together, Something, and Here Comes the Sun was a song that stood out, for all the wrong reasons. Maxwell's Silver Hammer was Paul McCartney at his most eccentric. A bouncy, music hall-style tune about a cheerful young man who murders people with a hammer. Dark lyrics sung with a smile. It was odd, theatrical, and unapologetically whimsical. To Paul, it was clever irony, a blend of macabre humor and old-fashioned charm. To others, including Mick Jagger, it was childish. Years later, when asked about the Beatles' later material, Mick didn't hold back. He said that some of their songs were brilliant, timeless works of art. But others, he thought, got a bit too silly. And when journalists pressed for an example, he pointed to Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Jagger laughed it off in typical fashion, but there was a sharpness in his tone. He couldn't understand how a band capable of A Day in the Life or something could also record something that sounded, in his words, like children's TV. It wasn't just him. Even John Lennon, who had little patience for Paul's perfectionism, dismissed the song as granny music. George Harrison and Ringo Starr both hated the endless takes, the constant retakes, and Paul's obsession with getting every tiny detail just right. To them, it was exhausting. To Mick, it was unnecessary. Part of what made Maxwell's Silver Hammer infamous wasn't just the song, it was how much pain it caused inside the studio. Paul was determined to make it perfect. He pushed for days, demanding new takes, new harmonies, new arrangements. George Martin, their producer, tried to keep the peace, but even he admitted that Maxwell's drove everyone mad. Ringo later said, "The worst session ever was Maxwell's Silver Hammer. It went on for 3 days. He joked that he never wanted to hear it again." While the Beatles were falling apart emotionally, Paul was trying to hold on, using control and precision as a way to keep things together. But to the others, it felt like he was forcing joy into a situation that had already turned sour. When Mick Jagger eventually heard the song, he saw through it. Not the irony, not the dark humor, but the disconnection. To him, Maxwell's Silver Hammer sounded like a band pretending to be happy when they clearly weren't. It's important to remember, by 1969, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were on very different paths. The Beatles were retreating inward, closing the book on a decade of dominance. The Stones were leaning hard into danger. Street Fighting Man, Sympathy for the Devil, and Gimme Shelter had given them a darker, edgier image. So when Mick Jagger heard Paul McCartney's upbeat, almost vaudeville-style tune about a singing murderer, it probably felt like a relic from another time. The world was burning with protests, war, and counterculture rebellion, and Paul was writing sing-alongs with a tinny piano, and bang, bang, Maxwell's Silver Hammer came down upon his head. It wasn't that Mick disliked Paul. In fact, the Stones admired the Beatles deeply. They had covered I Wanna Be Your Man, a Lennon-McCartney song given to them in their early days. But Mick always saw himself as the realist of rock, someone who preferred grit over polish. And Maxwell's Silver Hammer was pure polish. Ironically, Jagger wasn't alone in that opinion. John Lennon, Paul's partner, rival, and mirror, also hated Maxwell's Silver Hammer. He said bluntly, "I hated it. It was more Paul's music hall stuff. None of us wanted to record it." George Harrison echoed the same sentiment, calling it frustrating. Even decades later, Paul defended the song, saying it represented the inevitable pull of fate, something going wrong out of nowhere. But few listeners, even fans, saw it that way. They just heard a silly song about a killer with a hammer. To Mick Jagger, it was a sign that the Beatles had lost touch with what made them revolutionary. They were turning inward, experimenting not for progress, but for distraction. And when he compared that to what the Stones were doing at the time, channeling chaos, danger, and blues, it only reinforced his belief that the Beatles had gone soft. But here's the twist. What Jagger dismissed as silly, later generations found fascinating. Critics have come to see Maxwell's Silver Hammer as an early example of dark comedy and pop music, blending horror and humor long before it became fashionable. Artists like Elton John, Queen, and even Blur would later embrace the same theatrical absurdity Paul experimented with. Still, that doesn't change how people felt in the moment. To musicians like Mick Jagger, steeped in realism, rebellion, and raw sexuality, Paul's polished parody of violence felt detached, too clean, too artificial, too silly. In a way, Maxwell's Silver Hammer represents the great divide between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. The Beatles could be witty, ironic, and emotionally layered, but they often hid behind metaphor and melody. The Stones, meanwhile, leaned into the dirt, the sweat, the lust, the rawness of life. So when Mick called the song silly, he wasn't just criticizing a track, he was defining what made his own band different. For the Stones, rock and roll was about truth, even when it was ugly. For Paul, it was about craft, even when it was strange. Both philosophies created masterpieces. But in 1969, when Abbey Road hit the airwaves, Mick Jagger wasn't interested in irony or perfection. He wanted danger. He wanted chaos. And to him, Maxwell's Silver Hammer was neither.